When Dr. Malcolm Ellis, a successful black CEO and surgeon, visits a small-town diner, a racist police officer targets him with unwarranted harassment and humiliation. The confrontation escalates as the officer's prejudice and abuse of power are exposed, highlighting the systemic racism ingrained in the community. Malcolm's calm yet firm response to the officer's blatant discrimination reveals the challenges black individuals face, even at the height of success. As tensions rise, Malcolm's fight against injustice becomes a powerful stand against the corruption and racism that many endure in America. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bagels filled the air of Rosa's Diner, a modest but bustling eatery tucked on the quieter side of Elmsford. The kind of place where the waitresses called you hon, and the daily specials were written in colorful chalk on a squeaky board by the entrance. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find Dr. Malcolm Ellis, a world-renowned cardiothoracic surgeon and the CEO of one of the most prestigious hospitals in the state. Yet there he was, sitting at a small corner booth, dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his 6-foot frame folded comfortably as he skimmed through the morning paper. A steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of him, its surface rippling slightly each time a server passed by with a tray. For Malcolm, Rosa's was a rare slice of peace. No board meetings, no high-stakes surgeries, no glaring spotlights demanding his expertise. Here, he could simply exist. Outside, the morning sun struggled to cut through a thin layer of winter fog. Inside, the hum of quiet conversation filled the room, occasionally broken by the clatter of plates. Malcolm let the atmosphere wash over him, grounding him in the simple comforts of the moment. He had grown up in neighborhoods like this, where the sense of community often overshadowed the struggles that came with it. Humility wasn't just a trait for Malcolm, it was his anchor. As he folded his paper neatly, his phone buzzed on the table, the name, Catherine, assistant, flashing across the screen. He sighed, silencing the device. Whatever pressing matter it was, it could wait. He'd left explicit instructions not to be disturbed this morning. Rosa's wasn't about business, it was about something much more valuable, clarity. "Refill, Dr. Ellis?" asked Rosa herself, a stout woman in her 50s, with a warm smile that had welcomed Malcolm since his first visit. She wore a floral apron dusted with flour and a name tag that read, "Owner Rosa." "Please," Malcolm replied, his voice smooth yet soft-spoken. He pushed his cup toward her with a small, grateful nod. "Don't take this the wrong way, hun," she began, pouring the coffee, "but you don't strike me as the diner-type fancy guy like you could be at any upscale cafe in the city." Malcolm chuckled lightly. "Maybe, but they wouldn't have your French toast." Rosa beamed, shaking her head. "You're too kind and too modest. Don't think I don't know who you are. My nephew works at St. James Hospital. Can't stop bragging about the time he saw you in the hallway." Malcolm smiled politely, brushing off the compliment with practiced ease. He appreciated Rosa's warmth, but he never lingered on his accomplishments. To him, they weren't badges of honor, just results of hard work and opportunity. As Rosa walked away, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new arrival. Malcolm glanced up instinctively, his gaze falling on 2 uniformed police officers stepping into the diner. They looked young, mid-30s at most, with stiff postures and an air of entitlement that Malcolm had learned to recognize over the years. One of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, surveyed the room with an almost predatory interest, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Malcolm. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had felt that gaze. It was the kind that assessed, judged, and dismissed all at once. He turned back to his paper, willing himself to ignore it. The officers took seats at the counter, their voices low but audible. "Didn't think we'd find someone like that here," the buzz-cut officer muttered, just loud enough to carry. Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't let his face betray the slow simmer of irritation rising in his chest. He'd heard worse, far worse. Moments like these were minor inconveniences compared to the challenges he'd faced breaking into medicine as a black man. But no matter how far he climbed, how many barriers he shattered, some people would always see his skin before his accomplishments. He glanced out the window, watching a small group of schoolchildren shuffle past, their laughter muffled by scarves and coats. A deep ache settled in his chest. Not for himself, but for them. Would they grow up to face the same quiet humiliations, the same subtle but searing reminders that they didn't belong? "Dr. Ellis, Your French toast. Rosa's voice interrupted his thoughts as she set the plate before him. The sweet aroma of cinnamon and syrup wafted up, but Malcolm barely noticed. Thank you, Rosa, he said quietly, forcing a small smile. He picked up his fork and knife, but the tension in the room had stolen his appetite. The officers were still at the counter, their conversation shifting to sports, but every so often, Malcolm could feel their glances prickling the back of his neck. He kept his head down, his movements calm and deliberate, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Excuse me, came a sudden voice from the side, pulling Malcolm's attention. It was one of the officers, the stocky one. His partner lingered behind him, looking uneasy, but silent. Malcolm looked up slowly, meeting the officer's gaze, with an expression of practiced calm. Yes? You live around here? The officer asked, his tone casual but probing. Malcolm's jaw tightened imperceptibly. I'm a regular here, he replied simply. Funny, I don't remember seeing you before, the officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly. What brings you to this side of town? Rosa, sensing the tension, stepped forward, her brow furrowing. He's a paying customer, officer same as anyone else. The officer barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on Malcolm. Just doing my job, ma'am. You know how it is. Malcolm set his fork down deliberately, folding his hands in his lap. I'm just here for breakfast, he said evenly. If there's an issue, perhaps you could clarify it. The officer smirked, the expression dripping with condescension. No issue, just curious, you don't exactly blend in. Rosa opened her mouth to interject again, but Malcolm raised a hand, stopping her. It's fine, he said, his voice firm but calm. He met the officer's gaze steadily, refusing to let him see even a flicker of discomfort. After a long, tense moment, the officer shrugged. Enjoy your meal, he said, his tone almost mocking as he turned away. As he returned to his booth, Malcolm's hands tightened around the edges of the table. He took a deep breath, forcing the tension to leave his shoulders. Moments like these were reminders that no matter how far he'd come, he was still seen as out of place in the eyes of some. He glanced at his watch. It was nearing 9 a.m., and he had an important meeting scheduled back at St. James. For now, though, he remained seated, his gaze drifting out the window again. The fog had lifted slightly, but the chill in the air remained. Malcolm had just finished the last bite of his French toast when the officers stood up from the counter. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if trying to make their presence known to the entire diner. Rosa threw Malcolm a concerned glance, but he shook his head slightly, signaling her not to intervene. The stocky officer, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, sauntered toward Malcolm's table again. His partner trailed a few steps behind, his gaze flickering nervously between Daniels and Malcolm. It was clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with what was about to unfold, but he said nothing. Daniels stopped beside Malcolm's table, crossing his arms. His imposing frame cast a shadow over Malcolm's plate. Still here, huh? He said, his voice laced with something between amusement and disdain. Malcolm looked up calmly, his expression unreadable. Is there a problem, officer? Daniels smirked, leaning slightly closer. No problem at all. Just seems odd. You know a guy like you hanging out in a place like this? Malcolm's hands tightened subtly around the edge of the table, but his tone remained measured. A guy like me? Daniels shrugged, the smirk never leaving his face. You know what I mean. Just doesn't seem like your kind of scene. For a moment, the diner was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Rosa stood frozen behind the counter, her jaw set in a firm line as she watched the exchange. A few other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward Malcolm, but quickly looking away when he glanced in their direction. Malcolm met Daniel's gaze steadily. I wasn't aware that breakfast preferences required an explanation. The officer's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He straightened, resting one hand on the radio clipped to his belt. You're awfully defensive for someone who's just having breakfast. Maybe I'm just tired of being questioned for doing nothing wrong, Malcolm replied, his voice calm but firm. Daniel's expression darkened. You've got a smart mouth, don't you? Before Malcolm could respond, the other officer stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's arm. Daniels, let it go, he's not doing anything. Daniels shook him off, his gaze never leaving Malcolm. Stay out of it, Roberts, I've got this. Malcolm sighed quietly, his patience wearing thin. Look, officer, if you're not here for a legitimate reason, I'd like to finish my meal in peace. Daniels narrowed his eyes. Show me some ID. Malcolm blinked, incredulous. Why? Because I'm asking, Daniels shot back. Or is that a problem for you? It's a problem when there's no reason for it, Malcolm said, his tone sharp now. Unless you suspect me of committing a crime, I don't see why my identification is necessary. Daniels' smirk returned, now tinged with a challenge. Failure to comply could be considered obstruction, you know. Rosa finally stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. That's enough, officer. He's done nothing wrong, and you know it. Daniels glanced at her, his smirk turning condescending. Stay out of it, ma'am. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you harass my customers, Rosa snapped. Dr. Ellis is a good man, and he doesn't deserve this. For the first time, Daniels' composure slipped. Dr. Ellis? He repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. His eyes flicked back to Malcolm, studying him more closely. What kind of doctor? Malcolm's jaw tightened. A surgeon. Does that make a difference? Daniels let out a short, humorless laugh. A surgeon, huh? You expect me to believe that? Believe what you want, Malcolm said quietly. It doesn't change the truth. Daniels leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think your fancy job makes you untouchable. Let me remind you. You're in my town now. Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. And let me remind you, officer, that a badge doesn't put you above the law. For a moment, the room felt frozen. Even Roberts seemed to hold his breath, his hand hovering near his radio as though expecting the situation to spiral further. Daniel's face flushed with anger, his lips tightening into a thin line. Is there a problem here? A new voice broke the tension. Malcolm turned to see a man in his early 60s entering the diner. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his silver hair neatly combed, and an air of authority radiated from him. Malcolm recognized him immediately. Greg Hayes, the town's senior councilman. Hayes scanned the room, his eyes landing on Daniels before shifting to Malcolm. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Good morning, gentlemen, Hayes said smoothly, stepping between Malcolm and the officers. What seems to be the issue? Councilman Hayes, Daniels said, his tone deferential. Just a routine check. Hayes raised an eyebrow. A routine check? For what, exactly? Daniels hesitated, suddenly looking unsure of himself. Just, making sure everything's in order. Hayes turned to Malcolm, his smile polite but lacking warmth. Dr. Ellis, isn't it I've heard about you? Welcome to our town. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, his expression guarded. Councilman Hayes. Small towns can be particular, Hayes continued, his tone light but pointed. I'm sure you understand. Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly. Particular about what exactly? Hayes smiled again, the gesture not reaching his eyes. Oh, nothing specific, just maintaining order. There it was, unspoken, but unmistakable. The implication hung heavy in the air. Malcolm clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep his composure. He'd dealt with men like Hayes before, men who wrapped their prejudices in thinly veiled pleasantries, their words polished, but their intentions cutting. I see, Malcolm said finally, his voice steady. Well, I assure you, I have no intention of disrupting your town's order. Hayes chuckled softly, as though Malcolm's words were an inside joke. I'm sure you don't, but misunderstandings happen, especially when people aren't familiar with our ways. Malcolm rose slowly from his seat, his towering frame forcing Hayes to look up slightly. I think we're done here. Hayes's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Of course, enjoy the rest of your day, Dr. Ellis. Without another word, Malcolm walked to the counter, leaving enough cash to cover his meal and a generous tip for Rosa. The room was silent as he exited, the bell above the door jingling softly in his wake. The cold air hit Malcolm like a slap, but it was a welcome reprieve from the stifling tension inside. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his car keys. His usual calm was fraying at the edges, and he hated the vulnerability that came with it. As he unlocked his sleek black SUV, he caught sight of Daniels and Roberts exiting the diner. Daniels' smug expression made Malcolm's blood boil, but he forced himself to turn away, climbing into his car and gripping the steering wheel tightly. He sat there for a moment, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated or harassed, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But the sheer audacity of it, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than existing in a place someone thought he didn't belong, stirred a deep, simmering anger within him. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. "Dr. Ellis, it's Catherine," his assistant said. "Are you on your way to the board meeting?" "I'll be there shortly," Malcolm replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "Is everything all right?" Catherine asked, concern evident in her tone. Malcolm hesitated, staring out the windshield. "It will be." As he pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The board meeting room at St. James Hospital was a far cry from Rosa's diner. Sleek leather chairs surrounded a polished oak table, and the walls were lined with framed awards and glossy photographs of smiling executives. The morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows over the tense faces of the hospital board members. Malcolm sat at the head of the table, his posture commanding, despite the turmoil still simmering inside him. The events at the diner clung to him like an unwelcome fog, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not here, not now. Catherine, his assistant, leaned over and placed a thick folder in front of him. "This is the updated proposal for the Community Health Initiative," she said in a hushed tone. "You're still leading with that, right?" "Yes," Malcolm replied, flipping the folder open and scanning the contents. His voice was steady, but Catherine's discerning eyes caught the faint tension in his jaw. "Dr. Ellis?" one of the board members began, his tone hesitant. "I don't mean to interrupt, but are you all right? You seem—" "I'm fine," Malcolm interrupted, his gaze snapping to the man. "Let's focus on the agenda." The board member shifted uncomfortably, nodding. Malcolm's sharpness wasn't typical, but no one dared press him further. As Malcolm launched into his presentation, outlining the hospital's plans to expand healthcare access in underserved communities, his focus sharpened. The room was silent, except for his voice, which carried authority and conviction. This initiative had been his passion project for years, a direct response to the systemic barriers he had witnessed in his career. But as he spoke, a faint knock interrupted the flow. The room turned toward the door, where a security guard stood, looking uneasy. "Dr. Ellis, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent matter that requires your attention." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of a meeting." The guard hesitated. "I don't think so, sir. There are officers in the lobby asking for you." The room fell silent, a palpable tension settling over the board members. Malcolm's stomach sank. He already knew who it was. "Excuse me," Malcolm said, rising from his seat. He closed the folder with deliberate calm and strode out of the room, Catherine following close behind. As Malcolm descended the grand staircase to the hospital's main lobby, the sight before him made his blood boil. Officers Daniels and Roberts stood near the reception desk, their presence drawing curious glances from patients and staff. Daniels wore the same smug expression as before, but Roberts looked increasingly uncomfortable. "What's the meaning of this?" Malcolm demanded as he approached, his voice echoing through the spacious lobby. Daniels turned, his smirk widening. "Dr. Ellis, glad you could join us." "I don't have time for games, officer," Malcolm said coldly. "State your business or leave." Daniels held up a folded piece of paper. "We've received a report of stolen property, and your vehicle matches the description of one seen at the scene." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Daniels said, shrugging. "But we have to follow up, don't we?" The receptionist, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, looked between the officers and Malcolm. "Dr. Ellis," she whispered. "Should I call someone?" "No," Malcolm said, his gaze locked on Daniels. "This won't take long." Daniels took a step closer, lowering his voice but not his condescension. "You can make this easy, Dr. Ellis. Let us search your vehicle, and we'll be on our way." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I won't be subjected to baseless harassment, especially not here, in front of my staff and patients." Daniels's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Are you refusing to cooperate? I'm refusing to dignify this with a response, Malcolm shot back. Unless you have a warrant, you have no authority here. Roberts shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Daniels. Maybe we should... Quiet, Daniels snapped. He turned back to Malcolm, his voice low and menacing. You think you're untouchable, don't you, big-shot surgeon, CEO, whatever. Let me remind you, the law applies to everyone. And let me remind you, Malcolm countered, his voice rising just enough to carry through the lobby, that abuse of power is not the law. A small crowd had begun to gather, whispers spreading like wildfire. Staff members, patients, and visitors watched the confrontation unfold, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Daniel seemed to realize this, his face darkening. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. We'll do this the hard way. Before Malcolm could react, Daniels reached for his handcuffs. A collective gasp rippled through the lobby as he grabbed Malcolm's arm. Let go of me, Malcolm said, his voice icy with controlled fury. You're resisting, Daniels said loudly, ensuring the growing audience heard. Stop this! Catherine's voice rang out as she pushed through the crowd. You can't just arrest him without cause. Step back, ma'am, Daniels barked, his grip tightening on Malcolm's arm. Enough! Malcolm bellowed, his voice commanding the room. He wrenched his arm free, towering over Daniels. If you think you can intimidate me into submission, you've underestimated me. The room fell silent, the sheer force of Malcolm's presence freezing everyone in place. Even Daniels seemed momentarily stunned, his hand hovering near his holster. Before anyone could speak, a deep voice cut through the tension. What the hell is going on here? All heads turned to see an older black man in a sharp suit entering the lobby. His stride was purposeful, his expression unreadable. Malcolm felt a surge of relief. It was Judge Lionel Carter, a longtime friend and one of the most respected figures in the state. Judge Carter, Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Carter's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the officers, the crowd, and Malcolm. Officers, he said coolly, I suggest you explain yourselves quickly. Daniels hesitated, clearly unnerved by Carter's authority. We're investigating a report of stolen property, sir. Carter raised an eyebrow. And you believe Dr. Ellis is involved? He matches the description, Daniels muttered, his confidence waning. Carter stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Do you have evidence, or are you operating on assumptions? Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. Roberts looked like he wanted to disappear. That's what I thought, Carter said sharply. He turned to Malcolm. Are you all right? I'm fine, Malcolm replied, though his clenched fists told a different story. Carter nodded, then addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your concern, but I assure you, this situation is under control. Please return to your business. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. Carter waited until the last bystander had left before turning back to Daniels and Roberts. Officers, he said, his tone like steel. Leave now. Daniels looked as though he wanted to argue, but a single glare from Carter silenced him. He muttered something under his breath and motioned for Roberts to follow. Within moments, they were gone. As the lobby settled, Carter placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. You handled that well. Did I? Malcolm said bitterly, because it feels like I'm fighting the same battles over and over. Carter's expression softened. The fact that you're still fighting is what matters. Malcolm sat alone in his office later that afternoon, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him. The confrontation with Officer Daniels and the public spectacle it had created gnawed at his resolve. It wasn't the first time he had been targeted, but something about this encounter felt different. More invasive, more calculated. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed photo of his parents on the wall. His mother's stern but kind gaze seemed to remind him of the resilience she had instilled in him, while his father's confident smile echoed the strength of a man who had taught him to never back down. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Catherine. Dr. Ellis, she said quickly, her voice tense. You're not going to believe this. What is it? Local news outlets are reporting on the incident at the hospital. They're framing it as you being uncooperative with law enforcement. Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. Uncooperative? His voice was calm, but the anger simmering beneath it was unmistakable. Yes, Catherine said. They're using phrases like disruptive behavior and questionable conduct. Officer Daniels gave a statement claiming you were obstructing an investigation. Malcolm closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The narrative was already being spun against him, and he knew how quickly misinformation could spread. I'll handle it, he said finally. Have my legal team draft a response and contact the hospital's PR department. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the integrity of this institution. Yes, sir, Catherine replied, her tone steady. But there's more. Judge Carter called. He said he has information you need to see. Malcolm arrived at Judge Carter's office just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. Carter greeted him with a firm handshake and a grim expression. Malcolm, Carter began, motioning for him to sit. I've been digging into Officer Daniels' record since this morning. What I've found is troubling. Carter handed Malcolm a thick manila folder. Inside were pages of complaints, incident reports, and internal memos. Daniels had a history of misconduct, unlawful stops, excessive force, and numerous accusations of racial profiling. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, he had never faced significant consequences. How has he stayed on the force? Malcolm asked, his voice low but sharp. Cover-ups and complacency, Carter replied. The department's leadership has buried or dismissed most of the complaints. It's a pattern of systemic corruption. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. And now he's targeting me. Carter nodded. This isn't random. Malcolm Daniels thrives on intimidation, and you're a high-profile target. He sees you as a challenge to his authority. Malcolm set the folder down, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't let this slide. Daniels was more than just a rogue officer. He was a symptom of a larger problem. What are my options? Malcolm asked. You could file a formal complaint, Carter said. But I suspect it would be buried like the others. If you want real change, you'll need to go public. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Going public meant exposing himself to even more scrutiny, but it also meant shining a light on the corruption that had festered for too long. I'll do it, Malcolm said finally, but I'm not doing it alone. By the following evening, Malcolm had mobilized his network. Civic leaders, activists, and members of the local press gathered in a community center to discuss the next steps. The atmosphere buzzed with energy and determination, but also a palpable sense of urgency. Malcolm stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. What happened yesterday wasn't just an attack on me, it was an attack on our community. It was a reminder that no matter how far we've come, there are still those who see us as less than. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Faces young and old looked up at Malcolm with a mixture of hope and anger. Officer Daniels isn't the problem, Malcolm continued. He's a symptom. The problem is a system that protects him, a system that silences victims and punishes those who stand up. But today, we say enough. Applause broke out, but Malcolm held up his hand for silence. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability, it's about creating a future where our children don't have to face the same battles we do. As the meeting went on, plans began to take shape. A press conference was scheduled for the next morning, where Malcolm would share his story and reveal the evidence of Daniels' misconduct. Community leaders pledged their support, and a coalition was formed to demand systemic reforms in the police department. As Malcolm left the community center, his phone buzzed with a blocked number. He hesitated before answering. Dr. Ellis, a voice said, low and menacing. You don't know who you're messing with. Who is this? Malcolm demanded, though he already had a good idea. Let's just say a little birdie told me you're planning to stir up trouble, the voice continued. For your sake, I'd think twice. You have a lot to lose. Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. Is that a threat? It's advice, the voice replied. Walk away, Dr. Ellis, or things might get complicated. The line went dead. Malcolm stood in the darkened parking lot, the phone still pressed to his ear. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. He thought of his family, his career, and everything he had worked so hard to build. But then he thought of Daniels's smug face and the countless others who had suffered in silence. He lowered the phone, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just his fight. It was a fight for justice, for dignity, and for change. The next morning, Malcolm stood behind a podium in the community center, cameras flashing as reporters jostled for position. Behind him stood a coalition of allies, Judge Carter, local activists, and members of the hospital staff who had come to support him. "Today," Malcolm began, his voice steady but firm, "I'm not speaking as a doctor or a CEO, I'm speaking as a citizen, as a father, as a man who is tired of seeing injustice go unchecked." He held up the folder Carter had given him. "This is a record of Officer Daniels' misconduct, a record that has been hidden for far too long. Today, we're bringing it into the light." As Malcolm laid out the evidence, the room buzzed with tension. The stakes were high, and everyone knew it, but Malcolm's calm, commanding presence steadied the crowd. Just as he finished, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. The door swung open, and Officer Daniels strode in, flanked by two other officers. His face was red with anger, and his eyes locked on Malcolm. "This is a joke!" Daniels shouted. "You think you can smear my name like this?" Malcolm stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding but his expression calm. "This isn't about you, Officer Daniels. It's about accountability." Daniels took a step closer, his voice rising. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing." The tension in the room reached a breaking point as the crowd began to shout, some calling for order, others demanding Daniels leave. Malcolm raised his hands, silencing the room. He met Daniels' furious gaze and said, "If you're so confident in your innocence, then prove it. Face the evidence, and let the truth speak for itself." Daniels froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. The room waited, breathless, as the moment hung in the air. The room buzzed with tension, as Officer Daniels stood at the back of the community center, his face flushed with fury. The coalition, reporters, and supporters turned to face him, their murmurs growing louder. Malcolm remained at the podium, his steady gaze fixed on Daniels, who now marched toward him with the confidence of a man used to throwing his weight around. "This circus ends now," Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "You think you can drag my name through the mud and get away with it?" Malcolm stayed calm, his grip tightening slightly on the edges of the podium. "This isn't about your name, Officer Daniels. It's about accountability and justice." Daniels stopped a few feet from the stage, his lips curling into a sneer. "Justice, don't make me laugh. You're nothing but a self-righteous fraud who thinks his fancy titles make him untouchable." The crowd erupted in a mix of gasps and protests, but Malcolm raised a hand, silencing them. His composure never wavered. "I earned those titles through hard work and integrity, values you seem to lack." Daniel's face darkened. "You think you're better than me, strutting around like you own this town, stirring up trouble where there isn't any. You don't belong here, and you know it." There it was. The unspoken truth laid bare for all to hear. The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Malcolm asked, his voice sharp but calm. "That I don't belong because it's easier than confronting your own failures? You're not protecting this community, you're tearing it apart." Daniels took another step closer, jabbing a finger toward Malcolm. "You don't get to stand there and lecture me. You don't know a damn thing about me." "You're right," Malcolm replied, his tone unyielding. "I don't know you personally, but I know your type. I've faced men like you my entire life. Men who mistake authority for power and prejudice for principle." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Carter's voice rang out from the side of the stage. "Enough!" The judge strode forward, his presence commanding. "Officer Daniels, you've said more than enough. Every word out of your mouth further proves Dr. Ellis's point." Daniels turned to face Carter, his bravado faltering. "Stay out of this, Judge. You're just as bad as him, meddling where you don't belong." Carter's expression darkened. "Meddling? No, officer. I'm ensuring that justice prevails, and right now, you're proving yourself unfit to wear that badge." Daniel's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Malcolm stepped down from the podium, his movements deliberate and measured. He stood face to face with Daniels, his towering frame forcing the officer to look up slightly. "This isn't about me or you. Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. It's about the community you swore to protect. Look around, Daniels. These people deserve better. Daniels sneered, but his eyes flicked nervously to the crowd, where phones were raised, recording every word and gesture. The weight of public scrutiny was finally beginning to press on him. Dr. Ellis, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. You talk a big game, but at the end of the day, you're just another man trying to play the victim. And you, Malcolm replied, his voice rising, are just another man afraid of losing the power you've abused for too long. The room erupted into applause, the crowd's support emboldening Malcolm further. Daniels looked around, his composure unraveling, as he realized the tide had turned against him. Enough of this! Daniels shouted, his voice cracking. You think you've won? This isn't over. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Daniels could hear. You're right, it's not over, it's just the beginning. Daniels took a shaky step back, his eyes darting toward the door as though contemplating an escape. But before he could move, Judge Carter spoke again. Officer Daniels, Carter said, his tone laced with authority, I suggest you leave now, before you dig yourself an even deeper hole. Daniels glared at Malcolm one last time, before storming out, shoving the doors open so hard they banged against the walls. The room erupted into cheers and applause, but Malcolm didn't revel in the moment. He knew the real battle was just beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm stayed behind with Judge Carter and Catherine. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the weight of what lay ahead. That was bold, Carter said, a note of caution in his voice. But Daniels won't go down quietly, he'll try to retaliate. I know, Malcolm replied, but we can't let fear stop us. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone he's hurt. Catherine stepped forward, her phone in hand. The videos of the confrontation are already going viral. Public opinion is on your side, Dr. Ellis. This could be the turning point we need. Malcolm nodded, though the uncertainty of what came next gnawed at him. We'll see. Later that evening, as Malcolm returned home, his phone buzzed with another unknown number. He hesitated before answering. You've made a big mistake, the voice on the other end growled. It wasn't Daniels, but the tone was equally menacing. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Malcolm replied, his voice steady. And I'm not backing down. The line went dead, but the threat lingered in the air. As Malcolm stood in the quiet of his living room, he felt the gravity of his actions settle over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the full weight of what was at stake. Not just for himself, but for his community and the principles he had dedicated his life to defending. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn, and Malcolm was ready. The community hall was packed, its usual quiet replaced with the hum of voices and the occasional clatter of chairs. The press conference had drawn even more attention than Malcolm anticipated. Community members, local activists, hospital staff, and news reporters crowded the room. The tension was palpable, as if everyone present knew that what would unfold today could ripple far beyond Elmsford. Malcolm stood behind the podium, the thick manila folder Judge Carter had given him resting prominently in front of him. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone, his calm demeanor betraying none of the nerves tightening in his chest. This moment isn't about me, Malcolm began, his voice clear and resonant. It's about accountability, it's about justice, and it's about ensuring that those who abuse their power are held to the same standards as the people they claim to protect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Malcolm raised his hand for silence. He opened the folder, holding up one of the documents inside. This is just one of many reports filed against Officer Ryan Daniels. Complaints of racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power, all of them ignored or dismissed today, were bringing this evidence into the light. As Malcolm continued, detailing the contents of the folder, the crowd grew restless, a mixture of outrage and determination spreading through the room. But just as Malcolm was about to reveal the final, most damning piece of evidence, the hall doors swung open with a loud bang. All heads turned as Officer Daniels entered, flanked by two other officers. His face was a mask of barely contained fury, his eyes fixed on Malcolm with a predatory intensity. "This ends now," Daniels growled, his voice carrying over the crowd. Malcolm didn't flinch. "You're right, Officer Daniels. It does." Daniels marched toward the podium, ignoring the reporters and onlookers who scrambled to record the confrontation. "You think you can destroy my career with your lies?" he spat. "You're nothing but a troublemaker who doesn't know his place." Malcolm straightened, his commanding presence making Daniels' aggression seem almost juvenile in comparison. "These aren't lies," he said calmly, gesturing to the folder. "They're facts, supported by evidence and testimony, and you know it." Daniels laughed bitterly, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You're just another arrogant man who doesn't respect the law." Judge Carter stepped forward from the side of the stage, his voice cutting through the tension. "And you, Officer Daniels, are an embarrassment to it." Daniels whipped around to face Carter, his composure cracking further. "Stay out of this, Judge. You're just another bleeding heart who doesn't understand what it takes to keep order." Carter's expression darkened. "What you call order is nothing more than unchecked abuse, and today, that ends." The crowd erupted in applause, but Daniels wasn't finished. He turned back to Malcolm, stepping closer until they were face to face. "You think you've won, Ellis? You're just painting a target on your back." Malcolm's voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of unshakable resolve. "If standing up for what's right makes me a target, so be it. But you won't intimidate me. Not now, not ever." Daniels sneered, his bravado faltering as the cameras captured every word. "You think you're some kind of hero?" "No," Malcolm replied, his voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. "I'm just a man who refuses to stay silent." As the crowd cheered, Daniels' composure crumbled entirely. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the podium as though to tear it away, but before he could make another move, one of the officers accompanying him, Officer Roberts, stepped forward. "That's enough, Daniels," Roberts said, his voice firm. Daniels froze, turning to glare at Roberts. "What did you say?" "I said that's enough," Roberts repeated, louder this time. His face was pale but determined. "I've followed your lead for too long, but I won't do it anymore. This stops here." The room fell silent, the weight of Roberts' words hanging heavy in the air. Daniels looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing, as though he couldn't comprehend the betrayal. "You're out of line," Daniels hissed, his voice shaking with anger. "No," Roberts said, stepping closer to the podium. "I'm finally doing what's right." Malcolm met Roberts' gaze, offering a slight nod of gratitude. It was a small victory, but an important one. Daniels, however, wasn't ready to concede. "You'll regret this," he snarled, backing away toward the door. "All of you will." As Daniels stormed out, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their energy electrifying the room. But Malcolm remained focused, his gaze steady, as he addressed the people once more. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "Today, we've taken the first step toward justice, but the fight isn't over. We must continue to stand together, to hold those in power accountable, and to demand the change our community deserves." The room roared in agreement, the momentum of the moment carrying them forward. Malcolm felt a surge of hope, but he also knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. As the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm stepped off the stage, Judge Carter and Catherine by his side. The adrenaline that had fueled him was fading, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You handled that well," Carter said, his voice warm with approval. "But Daniels won't go quietly. Be prepared for whatever comes next." "I know," Malcolm replied, his tone resolute. "But we've made it clear. This community won't stand for his kind of behavior anymore." Catherine handed Malcolm his phone, her expression serious. "Dr. Ellis, we've already received messages of support from organizations across the state. People are watching this." "Good," Malcolm said, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "That means the message is getting through." As they exited the community center, the cool night air wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation. Inside, Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that real change was within reach. And no matter what obstacles came his way, he was ready to face them. The following days unfolded like the aftershocks of an earthquake, with ripples of the confrontation spreading through Elmsford and beyond. Footage of the showdown at the community hall had gone viral, sparking national outrage and widespread calls for accountability. Officer Daniels' name was on everyone's lips, not as a symbol of authority, but as a representation of corruption and abuse of power. For Malcolm, it was both a victory and a burden. Early one morning, Malcolm sat in his office at St. James Hospital, reviewing patient charts when Catherine knocked on the door. She stepped in, holding a tablet, her expression a mix of satisfaction and urgency. "It's happening," she said. Malcolm set down the chart and gestured for her to continue. "The police department just issued a statement Daniels has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Internal Affairs is combing through the complaints Judge Carter uncovered. They've also announced a review of all cases involving Daniels in the past 5 years." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That's a start," he said quietly. "There's more," Catherine continued. "The mayor just called a press conference. Word is, they're forming a civilian oversight committee for the department. Your name has come up as someone they want to consult." Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. Change doesn't come overnight, but this is progress. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received an unexpected call from Judge Carter. "Malcolm," Carter said, his tone measured. "Daniels has requested a meeting with you." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "Why?" "He claims he wants to clear the air. My guess he's trying to salvage what little credibility he has left. You're under no obligation to agree, but I thought you should know." Malcolm considered this for a long moment. Facing Daniels again wasn't something he relished, but the opportunity to confront him without the barriers of pretense or authority was too important to pass up. "Set it up," Malcolm said. The meeting was arranged at the courthouse, in a neutral conference room with Carter present as a mediator. Malcolm arrived early, dressed in a sharp navy suit that reflected his quiet confidence. He waited calmly, his hands resting on the table, until the door opened, and Daniels walked in. Daniels looked different, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with visible discomfort. He avoided eye contact as he took a seat across from Malcolm. "I don't know what you hope to gain from this," Malcolm began, his voice steady. "But I'm here to listen." Daniels shifted in his seat, finally meeting Malcolm's gaze. "I screwed up," he said bluntly. "I let my personal feelings get in the way of my duty." "Your personal feelings," Malcolm echoed, his tone laced with quiet anger. "Let's call it what it is. Your prejudice. You saw me as a threat because of my skin color and my success." Daniels winced but didn't argue. "But you're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my bias blind me. And now I'm paying for it." Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Do you regret what you did, or do you regret getting caught?" Daniels hesitated, his expression conflicted. "Both," he said finally. "I can't undo what's been done, but I want to make it right." "You can start by cooperating with the investigation," Malcolm said firmly. "Tell the truth about your actions, and about the culture that enabled you." Daniels nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I'll do what I can." As Daniels left the room, Malcolm felt a mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, and a lingering sadness for a system that had allowed such behavior to thrive. In the weeks that followed, the Civilian Oversight Committee was officially established, with Malcolm serving as one of its key advisors. His role was to help bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement, ensuring that voices long ignored were finally heard. The hospital board also backed his proposal for the Community Health Initiative, pledging additional resources to underserved neighborhoods. For Malcolm, it was a reminder that progress could happen on multiple fronts, even in the face of adversity. One evening, as Malcolm sat on the porch of his home, Judge Carter joined him, carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. The 2 men sipped in comfortable silence for a while, before Carter spoke. "You've done good, Malcolm," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for this entire town." "It's not enough," Malcolm replied. "There's still so much to fix." Carter chuckled. "There always will be, but every step forward counts, and you've taken a big one." The culmination of Malcolm's efforts came at a town hall event, where he delivered a speech to a packed auditorium. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, united by a shared desire for change. "Standing up against injustice isn't easy," Malcolm began, his voice resonating through the room. "It takes courage, resilience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it's necessary. Not just for ourselves, but for the generations that follow. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This fight isn't over. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And every step we take, no matter how small, brings us closer to the world we deserve. The audience erupted into applause, their energy a testament to the power of collective action. For Malcolm, it was a moment of triumph, not for himself, but for the community he had fought so hard to uplift. As Malcolm walked off the stage, Catherine approached him, holding a folder. "You're getting requests for interviews from major outlets," she said, "and a few organizations are asking if you'd consider running for office." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Office, that's a bit outside my skill set." "Maybe," Catherine said with a grin. "But if anyone can turn their principles into action, it's you." Malcolm laughed, the sound carrying a mixture of humility and resolve. "One fight at a time," he said. "For now, let's focus on making sure the changes we've started here stick." As he stepped out into the cool night air, the stars above seemed brighter than usual, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could break through. The battle for justice was far from over, but Malcolm knew he wasn't alone. Together, with the community and allies by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The quiet of the evening settled over Elmsford like a soothing balm. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of leaves, signaling the close of another season. Dr. Malcolm Ellis stood on the steps of the community center, gazing at the crowd that had gathered in the square below. The faces before him were a tapestry of hope, resolve, and unity. They weren't here for him. They were here for the promise of a better future. The events of the past few weeks had been a whirlwind, marked by confrontation, revelation, and a fight for justice that had taken everything Malcolm had to give. Now, as he reflected on the journey, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the struggle itself, but for the clarity it had brought. Malcolm had always prided himself on his resilience, a trait he'd cultivated through years of navigating obstacles as a black man, in spaces where he was often the only one who looked like him. From the halls of medical school to the executive boardrooms of St. James Hospital, he had learned to carry himself with dignity and grace, even when the world tested his patience. But this experience had taught him something deeper. It had shown him that silence, even when born of strategy, could sometimes be a barrier to progress. Standing up to Officer Daniels and exposing the systemic flaws within the police department had required Malcolm to step outside his usual role as a quiet leader and become a vocal advocate. It was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. "I've learned that sometimes it's not enough to lead by example," Malcolm told the crowd, his voice steady. "Sometimes we have to speak out, even when it's inconvenient or risky, because silence, no matter how noble its intent, can be mistaken for acceptance." Malcolm's struggle wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of larger societal issues that stretched far beyond Elmsford. Racism, abuse of power, and systemic inequality weren't new challenges, but they remained pervasive, often hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference. Officer Daniels had been a symptom of that system, not its entirety. "What we faced wasn't just about one man or one moment," Malcolm continued. "It was about a culture, a system that prioritizes authority over accountability and perpetuates injustice through complacency." He paused, scanning the faces of the crowd. Many of them had experienced similar moments of discrimination, humiliation, or dismissal. For them, Malcolm's fight was personal. It was a validation of their own struggles and a reminder that they weren't alone. "The truth is, systems don't change overnight," Malcolm said. "But they can change, and that change begins when people like us refuse to accept the status quo." The confrontation with Daniels and the subsequent investigation had sparked a ripple effect in Elmsford. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee was already reviewing cases of misconduct, and the community was more engaged than ever in holding its leaders accountable. These were small steps, but they were steps in the right direction. "Change doesn't come from one person alone," Malcolm said. "It comes from collective action, from communities coming together to demand better, to build something new, something fair." He gestured to the crowd, his voice rising with conviction. "You are the reason we've come this far. Your voices, your courage, your willingness to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' That's what makes a difference." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of affirmation that seemed to ripple through the square. For Malcolm, it was a humbling reminder of the power of unity. As the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm lingered on the steps, watching as families, activists, and community leaders exchanged handshakes and hugs. Judge Carter approached, his expression one of quiet pride. "You've done something remarkable here, Malcolm," Carter said. "But I suspect this isn't the end for you." Malcolm smiled faintly. "It's not, it's just the beginning." He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the lights of the city twinkled against the darkening sky. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles to fight, systems to challenge, and minds to change. But Malcolm wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt more prepared than ever. "My father used to tell me," Malcolm said, his voice soft but steady. "The measure of a man isn't how he stands when the road is easy, but how he rises when the ground beneath him shakes. This ground has shaken, Judge, and now it's time to build something stronger." In the days and weeks that followed, Malcolm found himself at the center of a growing movement. Invitations to speak poured in from across the country, and offers to collaborate on initiatives for systemic reform began to take shape. Yet, through it all, Malcolm remained grounded, focused on the community that had given him so much. He knew that true change would require persistence and sacrifice, but he was ready. For his patients, his family, and the generations yet to come, he was determined to keep fighting. The story of Dr. Malcolm Ellis wasn't just a tale of one man's battle against injustice. It was a story of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. It was a reminder that while the road to progress is often long and difficult, it is a journey worth taking. As Malcolm addressed another crowd at a future town hall, he left them with the words that had come to define his fight. "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And every step we take, every voice we raise, brings us closer to the world we deserve together. We can build that world together. We can rise." The applause was deafening, a crescendo of hope that echoed far beyond the walls of the hall. For Malcolm and the community of Elmsford, this was more than a victory. It was a promise of what was possible when people refused to stay silent. The story ends, not with a resolution, but with a call to action, an invitation to the audience to join the fight for justice, to challenge systems of oppression, and to believe in the power of collective resilience. It is a testament to the idea that even in the face of adversity, hope can endure, and change is always within reach.